My daddy has the same tattoo. 5 words. 4 years old. Barefoot. Wearing a dead man's shirt so large it dragged the floor behind her like a wedding train. She didn't go to the waitress. Didn't go to the families in the booths. Didn't stop for anyone. She walked straight to 92 Hell's Angels and pointed at the wolf tattoo on the arm of the biggest man in the room. 92 men stopped breathing because they knew that tattoo. They knew that shirt. And if this little girl was who they thought she was, then their brother had been dead for 9 months and none of them had known. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story traveled. The door to Billy's Roadhouse opened at 9:14 on a Sunday morning, and nobody looked up. That was the thing about Billy's on Route 35 in San Antonio. It was the kind of place where the door opened and closed so many times between 7 and noon that the little bell above it stopped meaning anything. Truckers came and went. Regulars slid into their usual booze without being asked. The waitresses moved in the efficient, unhurried rhythm of women who had been doing this long enough to know exactly how much coffee each table needed before anyone had to ask. So when the door opened at 9:14, nobody looked up. Nobody except Carol. Carol Hewitt had been waitressing at Billy's for 11 years, and in 11 years she had developed what her coworkers called the radar. Not a conscious skill, more like a tuning, a low-frequency sensitivity to wrongness, the way a dog lifts its head before the thunder that no human has heard yet. She was refilling the coffee at table 3 when she felt it. She didn't hear anything unusual. She didn't see anything at first. She just felt the radar tick, and she turned around. The little girl was standing just inside the door, blonde curls that had been put in a ponytail by someone who was trying very hard but didn't quite have the motor control for it yet. The elastic too loose, half the curls already escaped and hanging around her face. Bare feet on the linoleum, and a flannel shirt, navy blue, faded soft with years of washing, so large that the hem dragged on the floor behind her like the train of a gown that belonged to someone 3 times her size. She was holding a stuffed rabbit, white once, gray now, one ear completely missing, the other stitched back on in 2 different colors of thread, clearly by someone who had done it more than once and had run out of matching supplies. Carol took 2 steps toward her. The girl didn't look at her. She was scanning the room. Not the frightened scanning of a lost child, deliberate, purposeful. The way you scan a room when you are looking for something specific and you know what it looks like. Carol stopped, because the girl had found what she was looking for. Her eyes landed on the far corner of Billy's Roadhouse. The big tables, the pushed-together booths, the section that the staff privately called the Canyon, because on Sunday mornings it was occupied by 92 Hell's Angels, and the sound that came out of it was roughly comparable to geological activity. The girl looked at that corner with those pale blue eyes, and she started walking toward it. Carol stood with the coffee pot in her hand and watched a 4-year-old girl walk past 6 booths full of ordinary Sunday morning people, past the family with the toddler, past the 2 old men who came in every week and shared a newspaper, past the young couple on what was clearly a first date and was not going well, and head directly, without hesitation, toward the largest, loudest, most leather-covered corner of the room. "Honey," Carol said. She said it twice. The girl didn't slow down. At table 7, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who drove an 18-wheeler and had strong opinions about eggs, looked up from his plate and saw the girl and said to his seat partner, "That kid headed where I think she's headed?" His seat partner looked up, said nothing, watched. The girl reached the canyon. She stopped 3 feet from the man at the head of the table. He was 65 years old, silver gray hair pulled back, a jaw that looked like it had been assembled from something harder than regular bone, a scar running from the left side of his chin down to his collarbone. He was holding a coffee cup in a hand the size of a dinner plate, and he had been in the middle of a sentence when the sentence simply stopped, because the girl was pointing at his left forearm, At the tattoo on his left forearm, a wolf. Head down, teeth visible, watching something only it could see. Detailed. Old. The kind of tattoo that has been there so long it has become part of the person rather than a mark on them. She pointed at it, her small fingers steady, her pale blue eyes fixed on his face, and she said 5 words. My daddy has the same tattoo. Wade Calloway, Ranger, to every man in that room and most men outside it, had not flinched at anything in 11 years. Not a bar fight, not a wildfire, not the 9 funerals he had attended for 9 brothers he had ridden with, and eaten with, and bled with, and loved in the specific, wordless, bone-deep way that men love each other when they have shared enough road. He flinched, just slightly, just the tightening of the hand around the coffee cup, just the small shift of weight. But the men who knew him, and every man at that table knew him, saw it, because Ranger did not flinch, and he had just flinched. He set the coffee cup down. He looked at the girl. He took in everything. The shirt, Connor's shirt, was the thought that hit him first, before he'd confirmed anything, before he even knew her name, before a single word of proof had been offered. That shirt was Connor's. He'd seen it on the man 100 times. What's your name, sweetheart? He asked. His voice came out the way it always came out, steady, quiet, the voice of a man who had learned that the softer you spoke in a hard moment, the more people heard you. Emma. Emma what? She looked at him with eyes that were older than they had any right to be on a face that small. Emma Reed. The name hit the table like a stone dropped from a height. Derek Morrison, Tank to everyone alive who knew him, had a coffee cup in his hand. The coffee cup went over. Hot coffee spread across the table in a dark wave that reached 3 men before it stopped, and not one of those 3 men moved to stop it. Tank sat with hot coffee soaking into his sleeve and stared at the tablecloth like it had just told him something he would spend the rest of his life trying to unhear. Tyler Banks, Scout, was 26 years old and had never in his adult life been caught without something to say. He was the running commentary, the room's narrator, the man who made jokes at funerals because he believed that if you could find the absurdity in something, it couldn't fully own you. He went pale. Actually, visibly, completely pale. The freckles across his nose stood out like they'd been stenciled on. Nathan Pierce, Doc, grabbed the edge of the booth with both hands. 2 tours in Iraq, hands that had been steady in places that most people couldn't survive, even as memories. He grabbed the formica edge of the booth, and the table shifted an inch. Samuel Cole, preacher, reached for the silver cross at his throat. His fingers closed around it, and his lips pressed together, and he looked up at the ceiling for exactly 1 second, asking. Marcus Webb, Steele, who had not made an unnecessary movement in the 14 years Ranger had known him, leaned forward. Steele was the man who watched everything and registered nothing. He always looked the same. He leaned forward, and that single involuntary shift of his weight told Ranger more than a speech would have. Kevin Walsh, Spark, who was always crackling, always loaded with energy, always about to be in motion, went absolutely, unnervingly still. Ranger looked at the girl. He said her name again, carefully. Emma Reed. She nodded. Simple. The way children confirm facts, without understanding why adults need time to process them. Like she was confirming that yes, 2 + 2 was 4, and she wasn't sure why that was a difficult concept for the grown-up. Who's your daddy, Emma? She had clearly rehearsed this. He could see it in the way she took a half-breath first. The way someone takes a breath before they recite something they have committed to memory because they knew it was going to matter. His name was Connor Reed, she said, but everybody called him Blaze. Tank made a sound, not a word, not anything close to a word. The sound that a very large man makes when something sealed inside him for a long time tears open without any warning, and the contents have nowhere to go. Tank was a man who took hits, who absorbed weight, who stood between whatever was coming and the people behind him. He made that sound and then he pressed both fists flat on the coffee-soaked table and stared at them and did not move. Scout turned away. His hand came up over his face and the heel of his palm pressed hard against his eyes, like he was trying to physically push something back inside his head. Doc closed his eyes, just for a second, then opened them again and something behind them had changed. The temperature had changed. The way a medic's face changes when he has moved from the part of a situation that involves feeling things to the part that involves doing something about them. Ranger looked at the girl. He looked at the rabbit, at the dragging hem of the flannel shirt, at the bare feet, at the ancient, unafraid eyes. Was, he said carefully. You said his name was. Emma looked at him with those eyes. He died, she said, the way a 4-year-old says a true thing, without cruelty and without cushioning, because they have not yet learned that true things can be weapons. 9 months ago, the doctors said his brain was sick. Mommy told me. The canyon went quiet. Not the usual between sentences, quiet. Not the quiet of people pausing before they speak. The total silence of men who have been struck somewhere that has no armor, and are standing in the place where the blow landed, and are not yet sure how they are still upright. 9 months. Connor Reed had been dead for 9 months. Connor, who had ridden at Ranger's left shoulder for 11 years. Connor, who had pulled Ranger out of a burning shed in the hill country during a wildfire in the summer of 2019, with fire on 3 sides and smoke so thick you couldn't see your own boots, who had dragged him out by the back of his vest and taken a burn across his right forearm that left a scar shaped like a crescent moon, and who had said, grinning, "Don't worry about it, barely even touched me." Connor, whose laugh sounded like a man who was in on a joke the rest of the world hadn't heard yet, who had the particular quality of making every person near him feel like the most important person in the room. That man had been dead for 9 months, and none of them had known. Ranger felt something move in his chest that had no name and did not want one. "How did you find us, Emma?" he asked. She reached into the pocket of the enormous flannel shirt, and she pulled out a keychain. Leather, dark brown, the size of a man's palm, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling, cracked along one side with age. On one face, a photograph had been laminated into the leather. A group of men around a bonfire somewhere in the hill country, firelight on their faces, the kind of photograph you take when you are young and the road ahead still feels infinite. At the center of the photograph, laughing, his arm thrown around Ranger's shoulders, Connor Reed, 28 years old in that photo, strong, alive, grinning the grin. Ranger took the keychain. His hands were not steady. He turned it over, and on the back, burned into the leather in letters that were uneven and barely staying on the line, the handwriting of a man whose hands were no longer fully obeying his mind, was a message. Emma, these men are Daddy's brothers. Billy's Roadhouse, Route 35, Sunday mornings. They're family. They'll remember. They will help you. Find them when you need them. I love you to the stars and back, and then to the stars again, baby girl. Daddy. Ranger read it once. He read it again. He read it a third time, and then he had to stop reading it because something was happening in his throat that he was not going to let happen. Not yet. Not until he understood the full shape of what was standing in front of him. He wrote this, Ranger said. His voice was controlled in the way a voice is controlled when control is the only thing standing between a man and something he can't afford right now. He wrote this himself. When his hands shook really bad, Emma said, Mommy told me he made her watch. He didn't want to stop until it was finished. She paused for a moment. He burned the letters because he said it would last longer than ink. He said ink fades, but leather lasts forever. Scout's head went to the table. His forehead hit the formica, and he stayed there. Scout, who narrated everything, who had a joke for every silence, who had been the room's voice for 14 years, put his forehead on the table and said nothing. Tank was still staring at his hands. Doc's jaw was working, moving back and forth, The way a man's jaw moves when he is chewing on something that has no flavor and won't go down. Steele's eyes were on Emma's face, and something in them was cracked open. Not wide open, just cracked, like the first line in something that was going to split further before it stopped. Spark had both fists on the table, and they were not angry fists. They were the fists of a man who has just been handed a specific and righteous direction and has not yet been given the signal to move. Preacher was praying, silently. His lips barely moved. The cross was in both his hands. Ranger looked at the keychain, at Connor's face, 28 years old and laughing and alive, lit by the bonfire in that hill country field. He looked at the chin on this 4-year-old girl's face. That was the thing that hit him hardest. That stubborn, lifted chin. The chin that meant, I am handling this, and I will keep handling it, and if you try to help me, I will tell you I'm fine, because I don't want you to have to worry. Connor's chin. So precise, so perfectly replicated on a different face, that Ranger had to look away for a breath. He looked back. Emma, he said, where is your mommy? Something moved through her eyes. Fast, like a shadow crossing a field, there and gone. The chin stayed up, the eyes stayed direct. But what was left behind was heavier. She's home, Emma said. She has to stay near the machine. The machine helps her, but it makes scary sounds. I don't like the machine. A pause. She needs a new kidney. The doctor said so, but it costs too much money. Mommy tried to hide the papers, but I saw the numbers, and there were a lot of zeros. Not one man at that table moved. Mommy cries at night, Emma continued. Her voice was steady. She was reciting this, the way she had recited her father's name, because she had known she would need to say it, and she had prepared for the saying of it. She tries to be quiet, but I hear everything. I don't let her know I'm awake because she tries not to cry when she thinks I'm listening. The diner around them had stopped existing. There were other people in that room. There were other conversations and other lives being lived at 14 other tables. None of it existed. There was nothing in Billy's Roadhouse except a 4-year-old girl in her dead father's flannel shirt and the weight that she was carrying, which no 4-year-old should ever know the shape of. And the man who owns our building, Emma said. Her voice dropped. Not quieter, lower, like the words themselves were heavier and required more effort to lift. He's really mean. She said it simply, a fact. He comes to the door and yells. He says bad words. He hit the wall once so hard I thought the building was going to fall. A beat. He says we have to leave. She paused. He grabbed my arm last week, in the hallway. He grabbed it really hard. She held up her left arm. 4 bruises, the size of fingers. A grown man's fingers on a 4-year-old girl's arm. Ranger looked at those bruises. He looked at them for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked away, not because he couldn't bear to see them, because looking at them was doing something to the temperature inside him that he needed to control for just a little while longer. Daddy's letter said to find you, Emma said. She held up the keychain. He said you'd remember him. She looked at Ranger directly, those pale blue eyes, the lifted chin, Connor's chin, Connor's eyes, Connor's absolute refusal to look away from whatever was in front of her. Was he right? Ranger looked at the photograph on the keychain. Connor's face, 28 years old and laughing, and gone. He looked at his brothers, at Tank, jaw locked, already nodding before any decision had been voiced. At Scout, head up from the table now, red-eyed and resolved. At Doc, both hands flat, already in problem-solving mode. At Preacher, cross pressed to his lips. At Steele, phone already in his hand. At Spark, both fists on the table, and in his face a specific readiness. The readiness of a man who has been handed a direction and is only waiting for the word. Behind those 6, 86 more men filling the canyon, and every single one of them was looking at Ranger the way they always looked at Ranger when what he said next was going to determine what happened to all of them. Ranger looked back at Emma. He opened his mouth to answer, and then he stopped. Because his voice, which had been doing something unreliable in the back of his throat for the last 3 minutes, made it clear that the next sentence was not going to come out the way he intended unless he gave it a second. He gave it a second. Then, "Yeah, sweetheart," his voice cracked. He let it. Because this was the one sentence in his 65 years that had earned the right to crack. He was right. He reached out and placed one hand on Emma's shoulder, the hand that had bent steel and broken jaws and built things and carried weight and held brothers together in the worst moments of their lives. He put that hand on a 4-year-old girl's shoulder as gently as if she were made of something irreplaceable, which she was. "Your daddy was our brother," he said. "That makes you family, and we don't let family drown." He looked up. One look, not a speech, not a command, just one current of understanding that passed through 91 men simultaneously, silent and total and electric. No vote needed, no discussion, no time. "Tank." Ranger's voice had returned to what it always was, steady and quiet and carrying weight. "Get the trucks ready, full convoy." He looked to his left. "Doc, I need the best kidney specialist in the state of Texas. Names and phone numbers. 30 minutes. He looked to his right. "Scout, Sarah Reed, somewhere in this city. I need an address. 15 minutes. Scout was already standing, phone out, head down, moving. "Spark." Ranger looked at the crackling, coiled, barely contained Kevin Walsh. "Emma doesn't leave your sight." Spark crouched down. 6 feet tall, 230 pounds of man who had been called difficult and short-fused and perpetually ready for something, and he crouched down until he was looking a 4-year-old girl directly in the eyes. Something in his face did something it almost never did. It opened. "Hey," he said, "you like waffles?" Emma looked at him. Those old eyes, that lifted chin, the judgment of a child who has learned to read adults quickly because her circumstances required it. "With sprinkles?" Spark didn't smile. It wasn't quite a smile, but something happened near his eyes that was close to one. "Is there another kind?" Emma almost smiled. It was small and quick and gone almost before it arrived, but it was real. She reached out and took his hand. Her small fingers couldn't wrap around 2 of his, but she held on, and Spark held back. And something in Kevin Walsh's chest moved into a position it had never been in before and was going to stay there permanently. He just didn't know that yet. Ranger stood. Every joint in his body announced 65 years of hard miles. He stood anyway. "Saddle up," he said. "We ride in 20 minutes." Behind him, 91 men moved as one. The sound of it filled Billy's Roadhouse like a tide coming in. Chairs scraping, boots on the floor, the shift of 91 large bodies from complete stillness into motion. The waitress, Carol, with her radar and her coffee pot, pressed both hands flat against her chest and stood against the far wall and watched it happen. At the counter, Emma sat on a stool too tall for her, feet 6 inches off the floor, eating waffles with rainbow sprinkles. Spark sat beside her like a 230-pound personal security detail, his coffee untouched, his eyes on the door, on the room, on everything. "These are good," Emma said. "Yeah," his voice was doing something unusual. Thick. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, they are." Emma looked up at him, fork in hand, syrup on her chin. "Are you going to help my mommy?" Spark looked at this child, at the pale blue eyes that had seen too much, at the chin that refused to go down, at the flannel shirt that used to belong to a man he would have died for, and would still, even now, 9 months after that man was gone. "Kid," Spark said. He said it the way you say something when you mean every single syllable of it and you want the person to know. "We're going to do a lot more than that." Outside, 92 Harley-Davidson engines turned over. The sound rolled across the parking lot of Billy's Roadhouse and out into the San Antonio Sunday morning. Not like an arrival, like a declaration. against everything that had gone wrong for a dead man's family in 9 long months, against a sick woman alone with a dying body in a machine that wheezed in the dark, and a little girl who had been taking care of her because there was no one else to do it. Connor Reed had burned a message into leather with hands that could barely form the letters. He had trusted 92 men with his daughter's life, and 92 men were about to find out whether they deserved that trust. Scout had the address in 11 minutes. 47 Rosewood Court, apartment 2B, second floor, above a pawn shop, in the part of the city where the mailboxes had been broken for so long nobody expected them to work anymore. 14 blocks from Billy's Roadhouse. Ranger pulled out of the lot first. He always rode in front. 27 years at the head of the pack. But today the road was not just road. Today it was a straight line to a woman who didn't know that help was 11 minutes away. He twisted the throttle. Behind him, 91 engines followed, and in his vest pocket pressed against his chest, the leather keychain vibrated with the engine, as if Connor himself were riding with them one last time. They arrived on Rosewood Court, and 92 engines went quiet in sequence, and the sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. Ranger looked up at the building. He thought about the stairs, about Emma walking them every morning, bare feet on concrete, 4 years old, alone. His jaw tightened. "Tank, Doc, you're with me," he said. "Spark, keep Emma in the truck until I call." Emma was in Tank's pickup with the rabbit against her chest, watching the building through the windshield with the expression of someone deciding something important. "Is Mommy going to be scared?" Emma asked. "Not for long," Spark said. Emma thought about this for a moment, then she nodded, businesslike, as if fear were a logistical problem that had just been assigned to the appropriate department. They climbed the stairs. The railing was loose. The third step had a crack wide enough to catch a boot heel. Ranger noted each thing and said nothing, and kept climbing. Second floor. At the end of the hall, a door. Below the peephole, a piece of cardboard taped to the wood. A drawing in crayon. A woman and a small girl with yellow hair, holding hands, standing in front of a house with a red door. Below it, in large, careful, partially backwards letters, "Emma and Mommy's place." Ranger stood in front of that door. Just for a moment. Just one breath. Then he knocked. 3 times. Not hard, not soft. Sarah Reed, my name is Ranger. I knew your husband, Connor. Blaze." A sound from inside, movement, slow. The shuffle of someone for whom crossing a room cost something. The lock turned, the chain pulled taut. The door opened 4 inches. He had been prepared for bad. He was not prepared for this. Sarah Reed was 29 years old. She looked like someone had subtracted a decade from her face and then added it back in the wrong places. Blonde hair, Emma's exact shade, pulled back loosely. Collarbones too visible above her collar. Tubes at her left arm. And eyes, pale blue the same as Emma's, that were exhausted and terrified and holding on to something by the thinnest possible thread. But when she saw his forearm through the 4-inch gap, when she saw the wolf, her hand went to her mouth. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God." "We've got Emma," Ranger said immediately. "She's safe. She's downstairs with one of my brothers. She had the keychain. She came and found us. She's okay." Sarah's knees went. She grabbed the door frame and Tank's arm was through the gap before she hit the floor, catching her elbow, bearing her weight, steady. "Easy," Tank said. His voice, usually approximately the volume of a running engine, was barely above a breath. "We've got you. Can you take the chain off?" It took her 3 tries. On the 3rd try, it moved. The door swung open. And Sarah Reed looked past Ranger, past Tank, past Doc, down the stairwell, looking for her daughter. "She's safe," Ranger said again. "I promise you, she's eating waffles." Sarah pressed both hands over her face, and her whole body shook in the way that happens when relief is so enormous It cannot be told apart from pain. He said you'd come, she whispered. He made me promise to keep that keychain. He said Emma would know when she needed to use it. Her voice was breaking into pieces. I thought he was delirious. The tumor was affecting his cognition near the end. I thought he was confused when he kept saying it. They'll come, Sarah. When you need them, they'll come. Ranger looked at her. He wasn't delirious, he said, and Sarah Reed looked at him, really looked, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with anything except shared grief. Two people who had loved the same man, standing in the rubble of that loss, seeing each other for the first time. He talked about you, she said, all the time, especially near the end, when it was really bad. He'd be in that bed too weak to lift his arms and he'd say, Ranger knows what to do. He'd say Tank would make you laugh. He'd say Doc would fix it. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. He wasn't scared of dying. He was only scared of leaving us. That was the only thing in this world that scared him. Tank turned away, pressed his shoulder against the doorframe. His whole frame shook once, contained. Ranger looked at Doc. Doc had moved past them both into the apartment, and his face had changed. Not dramatically, the way a thermometer changes, a degree at a time. But Ranger had known Doc for 16 years, and he could read that thermometer. And right now it was telling him that the situation was worse than anything they had been briefed on. Ranger, Doc said quietly from inside the apartment, come here. Ranger stepped in, and he saw what Connor Reed's family had been living in for 9 months. A mattress on the floor, 2 milk crates for a nightstand, a portable dialysis machine in the corner, humming and clicking in a rhythm that was just slightly, persistently wrong. A card table buried in paper, medical bills, shut-off notices, eviction notices, collection letters stamped in red across their faces. The refrigerator with its door cracked open contained apple juice, half a jar of peanut butter, and a sleeve of crackers. In the corner of the room designated as a child space, a pile of crayons, a coloring book, 3 picture books, and a blanket folded into a perfectly neat square, the way a child folds it when someone has told her many times to keep her space tidy, and she has done her absolute best. Doc pulled Ranger 2 steps aside. Her oxygen saturation is at 83%, he said, his voice controlled and precise, the voice of a man delivering intelligence in a combat situation. That's critical. The home dialysis unit is keeping her alive, but it's not keeping her stable. Kidney failure at this stage with cardiac complications. Ranger, this is not a slow decline. This is active crisis. How long? Ranger said. Doc did not look away. Without intervention, weeks, maybe fewer. Ranger absorbed that. Best surgeon in the state, he said. Now. I already have a name, Doc said. Dr. Patricia Morgan, UT Health. She lost her own daughter to kidney disease 4 years ago. She's one of the best in the country. She takes pro bono cases when the cause is right. He paused. I believe this is a right cause. Call her. Phone's already in my hand. Ranger turned back to Sarah. She was sitting on the mattress. Tank was crouching beside her in the particular way of a very large man trying to bring himself down to the level of someone smaller. One hand on the doorframe for balance, talking to her in a voice that sounded nothing like Tank's normal voice. Ranger caught the tail end of what Sarah was saying. Tuesday at midnight, she was saying. He came and kicked the door until the chain bent. I had Emma in the closet because I didn't know if he was going to break through. She was in there for 40 minutes. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. She didn't make a sound. Not one sound. She was 4 years old in a closet for 40 minutes, and she did not make a single sound. The landlord, Tank said, not a question. His name is Roy Stafford. Sarah's voice was very quiet, not fragile, just depleted. He said if we're not out by the end of the month, he has people who handle situations. He said a sick woman alone with a kid doesn't have a lot of options. She stopped. Last week, Emma was coming up from outside. She goes and sits on the front steps sometimes when the machine sound gets to her. Another stop. Roy was in the hallway. He grabbed her arm, hard enough to leave marks, 4 of them. Tank's hand curled into a fist. Slowly, over several seconds, the geological slowness of something that is very cold and very large and has been given all the time in the world to become exactly what it is going to become. "What did Emma say?" Ranger asked carefully. "When it happened?" Sarah pressed both hands over her eyes. She said, "It's okay, Mommy. He's just unhappy inside." The room absorbed that. "She said it twice," Sarah said. 4 years old. She made excuses for a grown man who hurt her because she didn't want me to be upset." Ranger stood. He looked at Tank. He looked at Doc. He looked at Sarah. "She won't have to do that anymore," he said. He walked to the door and called down the stairs. "Scout! Spark! Storm! 3 more! Now!" Boots on the stairs. Then more boots. Then the particular sound of men who are coming with a purpose. And the moment Sarah saw Emma come through that door, held in Spark's arms because Emma had apparently decided at some point in the last 20 minutes that walking was optional and Spark was a perfectly adequate alternative. Sarah's composure, the fragile, white-knuckled composure she had been holding together with nothing but will and desperation, came apart completely. She opened her arms. Emma was across the room before anyone could track the movement. "Don't ever leave like that again," Sarah whispered into her daughter's hair. Her whole body was shaking. "Promise me." Emma's voice was muffled against her mother's shoulder. "I had to find them, Mommy. Daddy said to." "I know, baby." Sarah pressed her lips to the top of Emma's head. "I know." Ranger stood in the doorway of that apartment and watched a mother and a daughter hold each other in a room with a mattress on the floor and a machine that made sounds a child called a monster. And he thought about a man he had ridden with for 11 years, a man who had sat at a kitchen table with hands that shook and burned a message into leather because he believed, not hoped, believed, that this moment would happen. Connor Reed had been dying, and he had spent some of his dying building a road for his daughter, and his daughter had walked it. 14 blocks, bare feet, one-eared rabbit, dead man's shirt, 4 years old. Ranger pulled the keychain from his vest, looked at Connor's face by the firelight one more time. "She made it, brother," he said quietly. Only the room heard him. The room, and whoever was listening from wherever the road goes after the last mile. He put the keychain back against his chest. "Scout," he said. Scout appeared in the doorway, red-eyed, resolved. "Roy Stafford," Ranger said. Scout cracked his neck, and something moved across his face, part grief, part purpose, part a very specific and directional anger that had just been given an address. "Right now?" Scout asked. "Right now," Ranger said, and 4 men went down the stairs. Roy Stafford had built his entire life around one principle: find people with no options and remind them of that fact every single day until they either paid or disappeared. He was good at it. He had a talent for reading a lease agreement like a weapon, for knowing exactly which words carried legal weight and which carried only the weight of fear, and how often those 2 things were indistinguishable to someone who was sick and broke and alone. He had done it for 22 years. He had never once been on the receiving end of it. He was at his desk in the management office on the ground floor of the strip mall when the glass door opened. He looked up, and then the color left his face. Not gradually, all at once, the way color leaves something when the source of it is suddenly removed entirely. Scout walked in first, then Storm, then 2 more men whose names Roy Stafford would never know and did not need to know, and then Tank, who had to turn slightly sideways to clear the doorframe. Roy Stafford's back straightened, the automatic aggressive posture of a man who had spent 2 decades intimidating people who were smaller and sicker and more desperate than him. That posture lasted approximately 1 second. Then he saw the size of Tank and it left the same way the color had. Roy Stafford, Scout said pleasantly, the pleasantness of a man who is not in a hurry and knows he holds every card. Who's asking? Friends of Sarah Reed. Something moved through Stafford's face. Calculation. The reflex of a man looking for angles. She owes 3 months. I've been more than patient with that situation. You've been banging on her door at midnight, Scout said. I have a legal right to. You've been screaming through the walls, Tank said, from directly behind Stafford, who had not seen Tank move and flinched so hard his chair rolled back 2 inches and his elbow knocked his coffee mug clean off the desk. The mug hit the floor and broke, and Stafford looked at the pieces and then looked up at Tank, and something in his expression shifted from calculation to something much more honest. Fear. I have a contractual. You kicked her door at 2 in the morning, Storm said from the corner, and Stafford flinched again because he had entirely forgotten Storm was in the corner. With a 4-year-old girl on the other side of it. Stafford stood up. He was trying to locate authority that had completely abandoned him. Now you just wait a minute here. I don't know who you people think you are. Sit down, Roy, Tank said. He said it the way you tell a child to sit before they fall. Conversational, quiet, no threat in the tone because no threat was necessary. The statement was the threat. The size of the man making it was the threat. The 3 other men in the room were the threat. Stafford sat down. He didn't decide to sit. His legs made the decision without consulting him. Scout pulled a chair from the corner and positioned it directly across from Stafford. He sat down and leaned forward until their knees were almost touching, and he looked at Roy Stafford the way a man looks at something he has already fully assessed and found to be exactly as small as he expected. Let's talk about last week, Scout said. The hallway. He waited. The little girl. Stafford's mouth opened. Emma Reed, Scout said. 4 years old, blonde curls, one-eared rabbit. You know who I'm talking about. I didn't. You grabbed her arm. Scout's voice dropped to the temperature of something that has been underground for a very long time. Hard enough to leave 4 bruises, the size of your fingers, on a 4-year-old girl's arm. The silence in that office was the kind of silence that has weight. Stafford's mouth opened and closed twice. She was in the way. I didn't mean. There is no end to that sentence that helps you, Storm said from the corner. And Stafford flinched again, and this time there was nothing left behind the flinch, except a man who had run completely out of the version of himself he usually showed the world. Tank reached into his vest and removed an envelope. He placed it on the desk and opened it and counted out bills into a neat stack with the patience of a man performing a ritual that means something. $3,200. Laid out in order. Every bill face up. That's 3 months back rent, Tank said, plus current month, plus $50 good faith. He stepped back. Write a paid-in full receipt, sign it, date it. Stafford stared at the money. And then, Scout said, and he waited until Stafford's eyes came back to his face. Here is what happens next. Are you listening carefully, Roy? I want to make sure you're listening carefully. Stafford nodded. The nod of a man who has been entirely reduced. You never contact Sarah Reed again. No phone call, no letter, no knock, not a look in the hallway. If you see them in the parking lot, you turn around and walk the other direction. If your path and their path cross in any way, in any context, for any reason, you treat them like they are the most important people in this building, which as of today they are. Scout paused. Because as of today, we know where you live, and we know where you work, and we ride through this part of the city every Sunday morning. He let that land. Tank looked at the framed photo on Stafford's wall. Roy Stafford shaking hands with a local city councilman. The photo of a small man who needed to remind himself that he had proximity to things that could hurt you. That's a nice photo, Tank said. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Stafford. You look important in it. Stafford said nothing. You're not, Tank said. Not to us. Not in any way that matters at all. He leaned forward slightly. The woman in 3A. You raised her rent 40% last quarter. Roll it back today. The family in 1C you've been threatening about the parking space. Leave them alone. He straightened. Whatever you've been doing in this building to people who can't push back, it stops today. All of it. Stafford's hands shook so badly it took him 4 tries to write the receipt. He signed it. He pushed it across the desk. Scout picked it up, held it to the light, read every word, folded it once, precisely, and put it in his vest pocket. The 4 men walked out. The engine started simultaneously outside, and the sound rattled every window in the strip mall and knocked Roy Stafford's framed councilman photo sideways on his wall. He reached out and straightened it after a long moment. His hand was still shaking. He straightened it. And then he sat there alone in that office and understood, for the first time in 22 years, what it felt like to be the person with no options. Back at 47 Rosewood Court, Doc was on the phone. He had been on the phone for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, pacing the short length of the hallway outside apartment 2B with the focused stillness of a man who is choosing every word before it leaves his mouth. He had explained Sarah's condition, oxygen saturation, renal function numbers, the home dialysis unit, the cardiac complications, the malnutrition. He had answered 4 questions. He had listened. Then a pause on the line. Then a woman's voice said, "I'll be there in 2 hours." Doc came back into the apartment and caught Ranger's eye across the room. 2 hours, Doc said. Ranger looked at him. She's coming here? She wants to assess Sarah directly. She wants to see everything. The dialysis logs, the lab records, the machine. She said if the situation is what I described, she can arrange transfer to UT Health tonight. It's worse than what you described. I told her that too. Sarah was sitting on the mattress with Emma in her lap. Emma had stopped shaking. She was pressed against her mother's chest with her eyes half open, holding the rabbit, one small hand gripping the front of her mother's gown in the automatic grip of a child who has learned that the things she loves can disappear and is not willing to test that theory right now. Sarah looked up at Ranger over Emma's head. "We're going to get you to a hospital," Ranger said. "We're going to get you a surgeon. We're going to pay for it. Every dollar." Sarah closed her eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to feel something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. Something that might have been permission. "Connor," she whispered, not to Ranger, not to anyone in the room, just his name, said the way you address someone who can no longer hear you, keeping the conversation going across a distance that has no bridge. "He knew," Ranger said quietly. "He knew you'd need us. He trusted us with you and Emma. We're just doing what we should have done 9 months ago if we'd known." Sarah opened her eyes. "You didn't know he died?" "No." "He didn't tell you?" Genuine confusion crossed her face. "He was so sick at the end, but I thought he would have found a way." Ranger looked at the ceiling for a second, then back at her. "There was a falling out," he said, "years ago, before Emma was born. Chapter business. An argument about a decision that never got resolved. Blaze stepped back for a while. We never stopped being brothers, but the distance grew. And then we all assumed he was living his life and we'd find our way back to each other when the time was right." Tank's voice came from the doorway, low, not intending to be heard by anyone except whoever happened to be in the room. "The time just ran out before we got there." He said it like a man who didn't mean to say it out loud, and knew it didn't matter because it was true. No one answered him, because there was nothing to answer with. "We're here now," Ranger said. "That's what we can give. We can't go back, but we're here now." Preacher had activated the phone chain at 11 that morning. By noon, it had reached Houston and Dallas. By 2 in the afternoon, it was in Oklahoma City and Baton Rouge. By 3, it was in Atlanta, Albuquerque, Kansas City, and 6 chapters in the Carolinas who had not spoken to the San Antonio chapter in the better part of a decade. It didn't matter. They heard Connor Reed's name and they sent money. Old chapters, rival chapters, chapters with unresolved grievances from disputes that had happened before some of the current members had earned their patches. Every single one of them sent money when they heard the name. Ratch sat cross-legged on the floor of the hallway outside apartment 2B with his laptop open, running the incoming numbers with the focused intensity of a man for whom numbers were the most honest language in the world. He updated Ranger every 30 minutes. At 2:15, $41,000. At 3, $78,000. At 4, $109,000. At 4:40, a message came in attached to a wire transfer from 3 chapters who, as Ratch told Ranger quietly, wouldn't spit on them if they were on fire under normal circumstances. The message read, "Ghost was ghost. Whatever happened between us. Connor Reed was solid. For his kid. Every dollar." Ranger folded that message carefully. "Even dead," he said quietly, to nobody in particular. To the hallway. To the November afternoon light coming through the window at the end of the corridor. 9 months gone. He's still bringing people together. "Best of us," Preacher said, from behind his cross. "He always was." By 5:30, Ratch had a final number. $142,000, raised in a single day across every Hells Angels chapter from Texas to the Atlantic coast. Dr. Patricia Morgan arrived at 47 Rosewood Court at 12:40 in the afternoon. She was 44 years old and moved with the brisk precision of a person for whom time was not abstract. She shook Ranger's hand. She shook Doc's hand. She looked at the apartment and her face told him nothing that she was not choosing to tell him. She examined Sarah for 22 minutes. She looked at every piece of paper on the card table, the medical records, the dialysis logs, the lab work, the letters from the transplant waiting list, the insurance denials stamped in red. She looked at the home dialysis machine for a long time, and then looked away and pressed her lips together. Then she sat directly across from Sarah. "Your renal function is at 8%, Dr. Morgan said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was not gentle. It was honest. Stage 5. Your heart is compensating and beginning to show the strain. You need a transplant, or you need clinical dialysis 3 times a week. The home unit is not enough." "I know," Sarah said. "You are malnourished. Your body cannot absorb nutrients effectively. That affects everything. Your immune response, your cardiac function, your ability to survive a surgical procedure." "I know." Dr. Morgan was quiet for a moment. She looked at her own hands. Then she looked up. "My daughter was 22 years old," she said. "She had polycystic kidney disease. She was on the transplant list for 3 years. A compatible donor was identified 8 months before she died. The insurance denied the procedure twice. By the time the denial was overturned, her cardiac function had declined to the point where she was no longer a surgical candidate." A pause. "She died at 22. Her name was Claire." Nobody in the apartment moved. "That's why I'm here," Dr. Morgan said. "Not charity. Because of Claire. Because I swore on her grave that if I ever had the ability to save someone who was running out of time because of money and bureaucracy and a system that doesn't care about the person inside the file, I would do it." She looked at Sarah directly. "You are on the transplant list. I checked before I came. You've been on it for 14 months. There is a compatible donor organ that has been in the matching queue for 6 weeks. The reason it hasn't been allocated to you is that your insurance flagged your case as high risk due to cardiac complications. I can challenge that classification. With the chapter's financial backing, we can move you out of the insurance process entirely and go through UT Health's pro bono surgical program, which I chair." She paused. "I want to operate within the week." Sarah pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once. Then she pulled them back. "What are the odds?" she asked. Dr. Morgan looked at her with level eyes. She did not soften it. With proper nutritional stabilization and a few days of IV support to bring your body chemistry to surgical baseline, 78%. Without intervention, you have approximately 3 weeks. 78, Sarah repeated. It's strong. It's not a guarantee. I don't give guarantees. I give you the truth and my best work. Sarah Reed, who had been alone for 9 months with a dying body and a machine that wheezed in the dark, and a 4-year-old who made her own breakfast, looked at this surgeon who had lost her daughter and swore a promise on her grave. And she nodded. One clean, final nod. Then let's do it. They had agreed on Tuesday. Dr. Morgan had said within the week, and Tuesday gave them 2 days to stabilize Sarah's body chemistry, to bring her up to a baseline where surgery was survivable rather than simply possible. But Sarah's body had other plans. Ranger got the call at 3:40 in the morning. Doc's voice on the line, controlled and exact in the way it got when control was the only thing between a situation and catastrophe. Her oxygen saturation dropped to 71. She's conscious, but she's in respiratory distress. The home unit failed, a component in the filtration mechanism. Morgan needs her at UT Health now, tonight. Ranger was already on his feet. How long does she have? Hours, Doc said. Not many. Ranger made 4 calls in 90 seconds. By the time he was on his bike, the phone chain had already reached every man who had been in that waiting room. Every man who had been at Billy's Roadhouse 14 hours ago. Every man who had heard Emma Reed say 5 words and been changed by them. The convoy assembled on Rosewood Court at 4:27 in the morning. 92 bikes, 2 pickup trucks, 1 ambulance that Doc had arranged through a contact at a private medical transport company who had stopped asking questions when Doc explained the situation in a single sentence. Sarah was loaded onto the ambulance stretcher at 4:31. Emma walked beside the gurney and held her mother's hand and did not let go, even when the paramedics tried gently to guide her aside. Even when the doors of the ambulance were being prepared, she held on. "I'm right here, Mommy," Emma said. Her voice was steady, 4 years old and steady. "I know, baby," Sarah managed. Her voice was thin. The oxygen mask was already at her face. Her eyes found Emma's and stayed there. "I know you are." The convoy launched at 4:33. 92 Harley-Davidsons, 2 trucks, 1 ambulance, moving through the San Antonio darkness in military formation. The ambulance in the center, bikes flanking it on every side like a living wall. A moving fortress of leather and engine, an absolute refusal to let this woman die alone in the dark. The noise of it rolled through the sleeping city streets like a declaration. Near mile marker 204 on the state highway, a Texas state trooper running radar clocked the convoy at 11 miles over the limit. He pulled out, lights on, sirens starting. He pulled alongside the convoy. He saw the ambulance. He saw the formation around it. He saw 92 men on motorcycles moving with the coordinated, purposeful precision of people who are not breaking the law for the sake of breaking it, but because someone inside that ambulance is running out of time and they are not willing to let the clock win. The trooper killed his own siren. He moved to the front of the convoy and he escorted them the final 47 miles to UT Health San Antonio. Lights flashing, road clearing, every intersection held open by the presence of his cruiser, never once slowing them down. Not one word was ever exchanged. Not one word needed to be. At the hospital, the surgical team met them at the ambulance bay. Dr. Morgan was already in scrubs. She had been called at 3:50, and she had arrived before the convoy did, which told Ranger everything he would ever need to know about the kind of doctor she was. They wheeled Sarah through the doors at 5:19. Emma walked beside the gurney, matching every step, her small hand still in her mother's. Her yellow sneakers, the ones Preacher had bought at the hospital gift shop the previous evening, with the solemn intentionality of a man completing a mission, making small, squeaking sounds on the floor with every step. At the surgical wing doors, the nurses stepped forward. Sarah looked at Emma. Emma looked at her mother. If something goes wrong, Sarah started. It won't, Emma said. Baby, listen to me. Mommy, Emma's voice did not waver. It won't. Sarah's hand trembled. Her fingers found Emma's and held tight. She lifted her pinky. Pinky promise, Sarah said. I fight my hardest, and you wait for me right here. Emma wrapped her small finger around her mother's. The IV line pulled. Sarah's eyes filled. Pinky promise, Emma said. You come back and I'm the first thing you see. The surgical wing doors opened. The gurney moved through. Sarah looked back once at Emma, standing in the hallway with 92 bikers behind her, and the rabbit under her arm, and the yellow sneakers on her feet, and the chin that would not go down, not ever, not for anything. Then the doors swung shut, and Emma was standing alone in the hallway with 92 men behind her and a set of closed doors in front of her, and nothing to do now but wait. Ranger crouched down. She climbed into his arms without being asked, just reached up, and he lifted her, and she pressed her face into his vest and grabbed it with both fists. The tight, desperate grip of someone who has learned, in the hardest possible way, that the things you love can disappear without warning. She didn't cry. And that, the absence of tears, the controlled, preserved steadiness of a 4-year-old girl who had long ago learned that crying didn't change outcomes and had stopped spending herself on it, that was the thing that broke every man in that hallway. Not loudly, not visibly, but it broke them, because she should not have known that. She should not have been 4 years old and already understood that grief was a resource you had to budget. Ranger held her against his chest and felt her heartbeat, small, fast, like something fragile that had been asked to carry too much for too long and was still carrying it because no one had come yet to take the weight. He put his hand over the back of her head. She's going to be okay, he told her. How do you know? Because your daddy asked me to make sure of it, Ranger said, and I don't break promises. Emma pulled back. She looked at him with those eyes, reading him, the judicial thoroughness she gave to all important assessments. If Mommy doesn't come back, she said carefully, will you still be here? Ranger looked at this child, Connor Reed's child. The child a dying man had written a message in leather for, had trusted strangers with, had built a road for, even while standing on a road that was ending. He looked at her and he understood something that had not been fully clear to him until this exact moment, in this exact hallway, with this exact weight in his arms. This was not a favor. This was not charity. This was not 92 men riding in to save a stranger because of a name they used to know. This was family. Not the family you are born into, the family you choose, the family you earn, the family a dying man trusted you to be, and that you become, not by deciding to, but by showing up, again and again, until the showing up is what you are. I will be here, Ranger said, tomorrow, next week, next year, every year after that. I am not going anywhere, Emma. None of us are. You have 92 uncles now, and not one of them is leaving. She studied his face, the way she always studied things that mattered, thoroughly, without hurry, looking for the truth beneath the words. Then she put her head back against his chest, against the pocket where the keychain was, against the heartbeat of a 65-year-old man who had just made the most important promise of his life. Okay, she whispered. I believe you. The waiting room at UT Health San Antonio was not built for 92 people. It was built for families. Small clusters of anxious people who sat close together and spoke in low voices and watched the clock and drank bad coffee from a machine in the corner that charged $1.50 for something that tasted like it was sorry for existing. It had 43 plastic chairs arranged in rows, a television mounted high on the wall, playing a morning news program that nobody was watching, and a linoleum floor that had absorbed years of the particular specific grief of people waiting to find out whether the person they loved was going to be okay. It was not built for 92 Hells Angels. They filled it anyway. Every chair, every stretch of open floor. Men sitting with their backs against the walls, arms on their knees, heads down. Men standing in the corners with their arms crossed and their eyes on the surgical wing doors. Men who had been awake for 24 hours and were not going to sleep until those doors open. The nurses at the reception desk had made a collective, unspoken, institutional decision somewhere around the first hour that the normal rules of capacity did not apply to this particular morning. One of them, a woman named Diane, who had worked the surgical floor for 19 years and had seen most things, looked at the waiting room at 6:15 in the morning and said to her colleague very quietly, "I don't know what's happening in there, but every single one of those men would die for whoever's on that table." Her colleague looked at the room, at the leather and the ink and the bent heads and the folded hands, at a man in the corner who appeared to be praying and had been praying since before she came on shift, at the enormous man with the white hair who had been pacing 8 steps left and 8 steps right for 2 hours without stopping. "Yeah," her colleague said, "I see that." Ranger sat with Emma in his arms, and Emma sat with her rabbit, and the rabbit sat with its one remaining ear and its twice-repaired body, and the three of them held very still in the plastic chair nearest the surgical wing doors and waited. Emma was counting. He had noticed it around the 40-minute mark, her lips moving, a rhythm she had created and was maintaining with the focused determination of someone who needs a rhythm to hold on to when everything else is uncertain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Over and over, a private metronome, a self-built steadiness. "You want to tell me something about my daddy?" she asked without opening her eyes. It was not the first time she had asked. She had asked twice before. Each time he had told her something true, and each time she had absorbed it with the stillness of someone collecting pieces of a thing that had been taken from her too early. Building him back, one story at a time, from the fragments that were left. "First time I ever saw him scared," Ranger said, "was at his own wedding." Emma opened her eyes. "He wasn't scared of anything," she said. With the absolute certainty of a child defending a father she barely got to know. "He was scared of one thing," Ranger said. "Not messing it up. Not the ceremony. Not the words. He pulled me aside about 20 minutes before and he said, 'Ranger, what if I'm not enough for her? What if I can't give her everything she deserves?'" Ranger paused. "You know what I told him?" Emma shook her head. "I told him if he was worried about it, he was already doing it right. The men who aren't enough never ask the question." Emma was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "Was he enough?" she asked. Ranger thought about a leather keychain burned in the last months of a dying man's life. About a 4-year-old girl carrying that keychain 14 blocks on bare feet because her father had trusted it with his last breath. "Yeah," he said, "he was more than enough." Emma nodded slowly. Then she turned and looked at the surgical wing doors and went back to counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ranger looked over her head at his brothers and saw what he expected to see. Tank had stopped pacing. He was sitting now, elbows on his knees, hands folded, staring at a spot on the floor with the focused concentration of a man trying to solve a problem through sheer force of will. Beside him, Scout sat with his arm on the back of Tank's chair in the particular casual way that meant he was not letting Tank sit alone in whatever that stare was. Not saying anything, just there. Doc was near the nursing station. He had been near the nursing station for most of the last 2 hours, in the precise positioning of a man who wanted to be the first person to intercept any information that came through those doors. His hands were at his sides. His face was controlled. But Ranger had known Doc for 16 years, and he could see the tension in his shoulders from across the room, the slight forward lean, the readiness. Preacher had not moved from his corner in 3 hours. The silver cross was in both hands. His lips were barely moving. 12 hours of continuous prayer, and the man showed no signs of finishing. Ranger had once asked Preacher what he said during the long silences. Preacher had said, "Mostly I just stay on the line." Tonight, Ranger understood exactly what that meant. Steele was at the window. He was always at a window when there was a window available, watching the parking lot, the street, the gray November morning beginning to build itself outside the glass, keeping watch the way he always kept watch, as if the perimeter were a thing that needed holding by someone's sustained attention. Spark had sat down on the floor in the corner nearest Emma's chair and had not moved. His back against the wall, his knees up, his head bowed. Not sleeping, just present in the specific way of someone who has decided that his job for the duration of this is simply to be in the same room as that little girl so that she is never without someone close enough to touch. At the 90-minute mark, a nurse came through a side door and every head in the room snapped toward her simultaneously. 92 men, and the sound of that collective attention shifting was almost physical. The nurse stopped. She looked at the room. She looked at Ranger. She said, "The first phase of the procedure is complete. The donor kidney has been accepted into the initial vascular connections. Dr. Morgan is moving into the second phase. The patient is stable." The room exhaled. Not celebration, not relief, just the smallest loosening of the fist that had been clenching in every chest for 90 minutes. The difference between terrible uncertainty and terrible uncertainty with a single piece of good news inside it. "Halfway isn't done," Steele said from the window. It was the first thing he had said in 2 hours. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt its weight. "No," Doc said from the nursing station, "but halfway is better than where we were at 5 in the morning." He said it without looking up from the notes he was reviewing on his phone. The clinical details of the second phase of the procedure, the urological reconstruction, the connections between the new kidney and the existing infrastructure. The parts of this surgery that required the steadiest hands in San Antonio and the highest available margin of patience, because Sarah Reed's body, malnourished and compensating and pushed to the outer edge of its capacity, had no room for anything to go wrong. Doc did not share these details with the room. He carried them alone, the way medics carry the weight of understanding what is actually happening when everyone around them only knows that something bad might be happening. He carried it and kept his face at the controlled temperature and stayed near the nursing station and waited. Emma asked Scout for crayons around the 2-hour mark. Scout produced a box from somewhere in the depths of his vest with the same inexplicable efficiency with which he always produced things from somewhere in the depths of his vest. He handed it to her without comment. She sat down on the floor. The nurses saw a 4-year-old girl opening a box of crayons on hospital linoleum and made the same collective institutional decision they had been making all morning about the normal rules not applying. One of them brought the pediatric supply box from the children's ward without being asked and set it quietly beside Emma and walked away. Emma looked at the expanded selection of crayons. She looked up at the nurses retreating back. She said, "Thank you," in the precise, deliberate way of a child who has been taught that gratitude is not optional. Then she started drawing. Nobody told her what to draw. Nobody sat with her and guided her hand. She drew the way she did everything, with purpose, with focus, with the particular self-sufficiency of a child who had been responsible for her own functioning for much longer than any child should have to be. She drew her mother first. Center of the space in front of her, blonde hair and a big smile. The smile Sarah had before the machine and the mattress and the months of fighting a body that was losing. She drew her the way she remembered her, the way she wanted her back. She drew her father next to her, same yellow hair, wings because he was in heaven. She said this to no one in particular, quietly, while she was adding the wings. "Daddy has wings now. That's how come he can watch us from up there." She said it as fact, not question, not comfort, just a thing she knew. Then she began drawing the figures around them, all of them, brown figures, large and close together, filling every available inch of the linoleum canvas around the two central figures. She drew steadily, methodically, working outward from the center, one figure at a time. Spark crouched down next to her after she had been working for about 20 minutes. "Which one's me?" he asked. Emma pointed. "That one. He has the same face as you." Spark looked at the figure. "I don't look angry. You sometimes look a little angry." "That's just my face. I'm not actually angry. Uncle Preacher says you were born frowning." From his corner, Preacher said nothing, but the slow movement of a smile crossed his face, and his lips stopped moving for exactly 3 seconds, which was the first time they had stopped moving in 3 hours. Emma pointed at a figure with very large arms. "That's Uncle Tank." Tank stopped staring at the floor. He looked at the drawing. He looked at his arms. He looked at the drawing again. Something moved through his face that was the particular softness of a very hard man encountering something that has found the one place the hardness doesn't cover. "Who's the big one in the middle?" Spark asked. Emma looked up at Ranger. "That's you, Uncle Ranger. You're in the middle because you're the most important." Ranger looked at the drawing on the linoleum floor, at the woman with the big smile and the winged man with the yellow hair, at the ring of brown figures surrounding them so completely that nothing could come through. A wall of presence so total that it left no gap. He folded both hands over his mouth. Then he lowered them and looked at Emma. "It's beautiful, Emma," he said. "It's not done yet," she said. "The circle needs to be thicker. Can I have more brown?" Tank stood up and walked to the nurse's station and asked with complete sincerity whether they had additional brown crayons. The nurse looked at this enormous, white-haired man asking for brown crayons with the seriousness of a man requesting a surgical instrument, and gave him the entire pediatric supply box without a word. He brought it back and set it in front of Emma with both hands, carefully, the way you set down something that matters. She worked for another 20 minutes. The circle got thicker. And then the doors opened. Every head in the room moved. Every body leaned. The collective breath of 92 men pulling in and holding. A nurse. Not Dr. Morgan. A nurse, young, who stopped when she saw the wall of attention directed at her and visibly recalibrated before speaking. "Family of Sarah Reed?" 92 voices answered. The nurse blinked again, looked at the room, at the leather and the grief and the love that had been living in this space for hours and had become its own atmosphere. "All of you?" she said. "All of us," Ranger said. The nurse absorbed this. Then she said, "Dr. Morgan will be out shortly. She wanted me to let you know that the procedure is in the closure phase. Both kidneys are functioning. Mrs. Reed is stable and breathing on her own." She left. Nobody breathed for 5 seconds. Then Tank sat down. He did not sit down by choice. His legs stopped doing their job, and 93 kilograms of human being dropped into a plastic chair that screamed under the impact, and his shoulders came up, and then they came down, and then they came all the way down, and his face went into both hands, and the sound that came out of him was the sound of a very large man releasing something he had been holding together with everything he had for 6 hours straight. Scout punched the wall. He punched it, then looked at the dent in the drywall, then looked at the nurse at the reception desk. "I'll pay for that," he said. "I'm sorry, I'll pay for it." The receptionist looked at the dent, at Scout, at the 92 men behind him. "Honey," she said, "don't you worry about a single thing." Preacher crossed himself 3 times. His hands shook. The man who had prayed without stopping for over 12 hours, who had been completely, absolutely still in his faith through every minute of the waiting, began to shake when the answer came, because the steadiness was the asking, and the shaking was the receiving, and they are not the same. Steele turned from the window. He turned and faced the room and let the room see his face. His eyes were wet. The man who watched everything and showed nothing, whose face had been the same controlled temperature in every situation Ranger had known him in for 14 years, stood in the waiting room of UT Health and let every person present see it. Did not hide it, did not turn away, just stood there and let it be visible. Ranger saw. He moved until he was standing between Steele and the room, blocking the angle, giving him the cover of his back until Steele was ready. That was all. He didn't say a word. He just stood there and was the wall, the same way he had been the wall for Emma, because that was what you did for the people beside you. You stood between them and whatever they needed a moment from. And then Dr. Patricia Morgan walked through the surgical wing doors. She looked the way surgeons look when they have spent everything they have on something that mattered and are walking out the other side of it. Smaller than she had been 14 hours ago. Not diminished, smaller the way a person is smaller after they have poured themselves entirely into something. Her scrub cap was in her hand. Her gown bore evidence of 9 hours of work. She looked at 92 men on their feet. She looked at all of them, this wall of leather and grief and love and 14 hours of waiting, and something moved across her face that was older than sentimentality and deeper than professional satisfaction. She made it, Morgan said. 2 words. 2 words and the room came apart. Tank's face came up from his hands, red-eyed and crumpled and more honest than most faces ever get to be in the whole of a person's life. He looked at Ranger and his mouth opened and nothing came out, and he didn't need anything to come out because Ranger was already looking back at him, and they had known each other for 22 years, and some things do not require language. Scout grabbed Storm. They held each other for 3 full seconds and then stepped apart and looked in completely opposite directions, and both of them pretended it had not happened while everyone present saw it happen and said nothing. Doc walked to Dr. Morgan. He held out his hand. She took it. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. 2 tours in Iraq and a career built on composure, and he stood in front of this surgeon and could not form a single syllable. He shook her hand. He nodded once. She looked at him and nodded back. Everything that needed to be said between 2 people who understood the full weight of what had happened inside that surgical wing was said in those 4 seconds without a word spoken. Spark was on the floor with his head bowed and both fists on his knees. Something in him that had been wound tight for his entire adult life was coming undone, and it felt like falling apart and like coming home at the exact same time. And he let it happen because he was too tired and too relieved and too broken open to stop it. She's a fighter, Dr. Morgan said to Ranger. I've done hundreds of transplants. The patient's will is a factor. I can't give you a number for it. I can't put it in a chart. But I can tell you that her body was failing and her will was not. I felt it on the table. She has a daughter who needs her, Ranger said. Dr. Morgan looked at Emma, still in Ranger's arms, still holding the rabbit, still holding the vest. She's not going anywhere, Morgan said. And then Emma stirred. She blinked. The waiting room came into focus around her. Faces, wet faces. 92 men in leather in a hospital waiting room. The strangest and most beautiful thing in the world. Uncle Ranger, her voice was soft from sleep. Small. Yeah, kid. Is Mommy okay? Ranger looked at Dr. Morgan. Morgan nodded, and then nodded again with more conviction. The second nod, the one that meant not just yes, but yes, and I am certain of it. Ranger looked at Emma. Your mommy's okay, he said. Dr. Morgan fixed what needed fixing. Both kidneys, new ones. They work. Emma stared at him. Fixed? She said. Like actually fixed? Both of them. They work now. Emma's eyes went wide, and then something happened in her face. Not the controlled steadiness, not the lifted chin, not the pale blue ancient eyes that had learned too young to hold themselves together. Something in all of that gave way. The scaffolding that a 4-year-old girl had built to hold herself upright for 9 months of impossible weight gave way all at once, completely, without warning. She screamed. Not a word, a sound, the sound that lives below language, below thought, in the part of a child's body where all the absorbed terror has been stored and sealed, and is finally finally given permission to come out. She screamed for her daddy dying in a bed that smelled like medicine, for her mommy coughing through the nights while a machine wheezed in the dark, for the bruise on her arm and the mean man in the hallway and the closet where she sat for 40 minutes and did not make a single sound, for the crackers and peanut butter in the empty refrigerator in the morning she got herself dressed and made her own breakfast because her mommy couldn't always get up. For 9 months of being 4 years old and not allowed to be, Ranger held her, both arms, full weight. He did not say, "It's okay." He did not say, "Don't cry." He did not say, "Be strong," or "You're all right." None of the things adults say when a child's grief makes them uncomfortable. He held her and absorbed every sob and every shake and stood there with his arms around this 4-year-old girl and was the wall. The thing that stays firm while everything else finally falls. Around them, 91 men stood in silence and let it happen. Tank pressed the back of his fist against his mouth and let his own tears fall without doing a single thing about them. Preacher's hands covered his face and his shoulders moved, and the silver cross caught the fluorescent light and threw it back. Steele stood with his back to the window now and cried openly, in the way of someone who has decided that this moment is simply larger than his habit of not being seen, and that that's all right. Spark sat on the floor with his head bowed and let something that had been wound tight in him for his entire adult life finally come loose. Scout pressed his forehead to the wall and his body shook once, hard. Doc stood very still, with both hands at his sides and his eyes on the ceiling, doing the thing he had always done in the worst and best moments, staying vertical, staying present, staying with it, because the thing about caring for people is that you absorb what they carry and you do not put it down until they are safe. And they were safe, and so he stood there and let it land. Emma cried for 13 minutes. When she stopped, it was gradual. The shaking slowed. The sobs became breath. The breath became steadier. She pulled back and looked at Ranger with swollen eyes and a face streaked with everything she had been holding, and the particular raw radiance of a child who has just been given back the right to be exactly her age. "Can I see her?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse, small, but steady again, because she was Connor Reed's daughter and steady was what she came back to. Ranger looked at Morgan. Morgan nodded, then nodded again with more conviction. "5 minutes, Morgan said. "She's sedated, she won't wake, but you can be with her." Ranger carried Emma through the surgical wing doors, down the corridor, into the recovery room. Sarah lay on the hospital bed with tubes in her arms and monitors on her chest and her oxygen mask in place, and her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was, for the first time in years, correct. Emma reached out and touched her mother's hand. "Hi, Mommy," she whispered. "It worked. Dr. Morgan fixed it. You kept your pinky promise." The monitors beeped. Sarah did not move. Emma carefully climbed onto the bed. She pressed herself against her mother's side and put her small hand on her mother's chest, directly over the left side, directly over the heart that was still beating. She was still for a moment. "I can feel it," she whispered. "I can feel your heart, Mommy. You're okay. You're really okay." She closed her eyes. Within 30 seconds, she was asleep, curled against her mother's arm, her hand on her mother's chest, her rabbit between them, listening, even in sleep, to the steady, living rhythm of a body that had been rebuilt by a surgeon who lost her daughter and swore she would not let it happen again to someone else. Ranger stood in the doorway and looked at them, mother and daughter, both breathing, both still, both alive in the specific, precious, unguaranteed way that people are alive when they have just come through something that nearly wasn't survived. He pulled the keychain from his vest, looked at Connor's laughing face by the bonfire light. "They're okay, brother," he said quietly, "the way you say something to someone who is somewhere else, but close enough to hear. Both of them. They're okay." He put the keychain back against his heart and stood in that doorway for the next 4 hours, without moving an inch. Because some promises don't end when the surgery is over. Some promises are just beginning. And Ranger had made one to a dead man and another to a 4-year-old girl, and both of them were going to be honored the same way. Every promise he had ever made in his 65 years had been honored, by staying exactly where he said he would be. Sarah Reed opened her eyes on Thursday morning, and the first thing she saw was Emma's face 4 inches from her own. Pale blue eyes, wide open, watching, waiting for the exact moment her mother's eyes opened, the way Emma waited for everything that mattered, with complete stillness and total attention, and no indication whatsoever that she had any intention of doing anything else until the thing she was waiting for happened. "Mommy!" "I'm here, baby." Emma tilted her head and studied her mother's face with the judicial thoroughness she brought to all important assessments. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" "Peaceful." A pause. "Not scared peaceful. Before you always looked scared peaceful, like you were trying to look okay so I wouldn't worry. This is different. This is actually peaceful." Sarah reached out and touched her daughter's face with a hand that had no tubes in it. Warm, real, solid. She pressed her palm against Emma's cheek and held it there for a long moment, feeling the warmth of it, making it real in the way you make things real when you were not entirely sure, 2 days ago, that you were going to be alive to feel anything. "I'm not scared anymore," Sarah said. "Because the doctor fixed you? Because you found them." Sarah's voice cracked on the last word, and she let it crack because she was done spending energy on keeping things from cracking. "Because you walked 14 blocks all by yourself and found 92 people who love your daddy. You saved my life, Emma. You know that?" Emma shook her head immediately, firmly, the way she rejected things she was certain were wrong. "Daddy saved you," she said. "He wrote the message. I just delivered it." Sarah looked at her daughter, 4 years old, sitting cross-legged on a hospital bed in yellow sneakers and a flannel shirt that had been washed twice since Sunday morning, with a one-eared rabbit in her lap and the absolute unshakable conviction of a child who knows the difference between credit and truth. And she laughed. Wet and weak, but a real laugh. The first real laugh in 9 months that did not feel like something borrowed against a future she was not sure she was going to have. "Yeah," Sarah said. "Okay, Daddy saved me." She pulled Emma forward until Emma's forehead was against hers. "But you carried the message." Emma considered this, decided it was accurate, nodded against her mother's forehead. "We both did the important parts," Emma said. "Yeah, baby, we both did." Ranger was in the hallway when Sarah's door opened, and Doc came out with the Thursday morning labs in his hand and an expression on his face that Ranger had not seen in 16 years of knowing him. Not the controlled temperature, not the medic's careful neutral. Something warmer than that. Something that Doc had been keeping behind professional distance for so long that when it came out, it looked slightly unfamiliar on him. The way a man looks when he smiles with his whole face after years of only smiling with part of it. "Her creatinine levels dropped 40% overnight," Doc said. "The new kidneys are functioning at full capacity. Oxygen saturation 97%. Cardiac rhythm normal." He paused. "She's going to need 8 to 12 weeks of recovery. Physical therapy, medication management, careful monitoring. It will not be easy." Another pause. "But she's going to be here for Emma's 5th birthday." Ranger absorbed that. He absorbed all of it. The numbers, the clinical language, the careful, professional framing. And underneath all of it was one fact that reduced everything else to noise. She is going to be here for Emma's 5th birthday. "Good," he said. It was not enough of a word, not by any measure, but it was the only one that came, and he said it, and Doc understood it the same way Steele understood things. Not through what was said, but through everything that surrounded what was said. "There's something else," Doc said. He lowered his voice slightly. Dr. Morgan is recommending a 60-day supervised recovery in a facility with clinical dialysis access before Sarah transitions to full home care. That level of post-surgical care is paid for, Ranger said. Ranger, we're talking about another 40,000 is paid for, Ranger said again. Ratch has the numbers. It's covered. All of it. Doc looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once and put the labs in his vest pocket and went back into Sarah's room. And that was the end of the conversation about money. The brothers came in shifts over the following days. Not organized shifts, not assigned rotations. Nobody sat down and made a schedule. It organized itself the way things organized themselves when 92 people were paying attention to the same thing. Tank arrived Tuesday morning with a bag of food from a barbecue place on the south side that Sarah had mentioned wanting exactly once, in passing, during a conversation about things she missed before she got sick. He materialized it in her hospital room like it was a completely normal thing to do and set it on her bedside tray and said, "You need to eat, doctor's orders." Even though those were not remotely the doctor's orders, and Doc, who was present, looked at the ceiling and said nothing. "The nurse is going to catch you with that," Doc said. "Then I'll share with the nurse," Tank said, and opened the bag. Scout came Wednesday and Friday, and both times he sat with Emma in the corridor outside Sarah's room and let her explain things to him at great length. Emma had developed in the previous 48 hours strong opinions about the correct way to color a hospital waiting room coloring book page, and Scout was her primary audience for these opinions. He sat on the floor with his long legs folded and his back against the wall, and his face arranged in the expression of a man receiving critically important information. And every so often he said, "Okay, but what if I used blue there?" And every time Emma said, "That's wrong, Uncle Scout," and every time Scout said, "Why is it wrong?" And every time Emma explained it again from the beginning, patiently, because she had decided he needed more help than most. "She's going to be a teacher," Scout told Ranger on Friday evening, in the hallway, with complete conviction. "Or a judge. Something where she gets to tell other people when they're wrong." "She already does that," Ranger said. "Yeah," Scout said, "she's extremely good at it." On Saturday morning, 8 days after surgery, Sarah sat up on her own for the first time. No assistance. She pulled herself upright, slowly, jaw set against the pull of the incisions and the protest of muscles that had been through a war, and she sat on the edge of the hospital bed with her feet dangling 6 inches from the floor and her hands braced on either side of her, and she breathed through it. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The controlled breathing of someone who has decided that pain is a thing to be managed, not a thing to be stopped by. Emma was watching her from the chair beside the bed, very still, ready. "I'm okay," Sarah said before Emma could ask. "I know," Emma said, "but I'm watching anyway." Sarah looked at her daughter and felt something move through her that had no clean name. Not just love. Love was always there. Love was the baseline. Love was the air. This was something else, something that had to do with a specific person Emma had become in 9 months of impossible circumstances. The person she had built herself into out of the materials available. A dead father's flannel shirt and a one-eared rabbit and a promise made to a dying man by a 3.5-year-old girl who had apparently decided that a promise was a promise, regardless of the age of the person making it. "Come here," Sarah said. Emma crossed the room and climbed carefully up onto the bed beside her mother, navigating around the IV lines and the monitor leads with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for a week. And Sarah put her arm around her, and they sat together on the edge of the hospital bed, with the November morning coming through the window and the monitors beeping their steady reassurance. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said. "Okay, you were so brave. These last 9 months, you were so impossibly brave. And I need you to know that you never had to be that brave. That was not your job to carry. You were supposed to be little. You were supposed to just be little." Emma thought about this for a moment. "But somebody had to," she said simply. "And you were sick. That's not... Mommy. Emma looked up at her mother with those pale blue eyes. It's okay. I didn't mind. She paused. Well, sometimes I minded the peanut butter crackers. We had them a lot. Sarah made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, and not fully either one. When you get home, Sarah said, I will make you anything you want for breakfast every single morning. Emma considered this seriously. Waffles with rainbow sprinkles? Every morning if you want. Uncle Spark says that's not a nutritionally complete breakfast. Uncle Spark is correct, Sarah said, but Uncle Spark also held you for 6 hours straight in a plastic chair, so he gets a vote, and his vote is that you should have what you want. Emma smiled. Not the small, quick smile from that first Sunday morning in Billy's Roadhouse that appeared and vanished before it fully arrived. A real smile. Full, unhurried. The smile of a child who has been given back the time to have one. The conversation about the house happened on the 12th day. Ranger had been waiting for the right moment, which meant he had been waiting for a moment when Sarah was strong enough to process something without it costing her energy she needed for healing. He sat down beside her bed that afternoon while Emma was down the hall with Spark and Preacher. Spark was teaching her a card game. Preacher was supervising to ensure the game being taught was appropriate. A dynamic that had been generating ongoing low-level debate for 45 minutes. And he said, We need to talk about what happens when you leave here. Sarah looked at him carefully. I can't go back to Rosewood Court. You're not going back to Rosewood Court. Ranger, I can't let you. You're not going back to Rosewood Court, he said again. Not unkindly, just settled. The voice of a decision that had already been made and was not a discussion. We found a house, 2 bedrooms, quiet street, good neighborhood. The oak tree in the front yard is about 60 years old, and Emma is already going to love it. Sarah stared at him. That is not something I can accept, she said. First month is paid, deposit covered, furnished, pantry stocked. Ratch has set up a recovery fund that covers your clinical costs and living expenses for the next 18 months while you get back on your feet. After that, you're on your own, and I expect you to pay every dollar of it forward someday to someone who needs it. He paused. That's not charity. That's a system. And it's the only kind we run. Sarah pressed both hands against her eyes. Her shoulders shook once, then twice. You don't even know me, she said. Her voice was muffled behind her hands. You didn't know I existed 2 weeks ago. I knew Connor, Ranger said. For 11 years I knew him. And if he loved you the way it's clear that he loved you, then I don't need to know you independently. I already know the most important thing. He paused. The most important thing is that you raised Emma Reed. You raised that child. And she walked into a diner barefoot in her dead daddy's shirt and stood in front of 92 strangers and didn't flinch once. He paused again. That kind of child doesn't come from nowhere. She came from you. Sarah lowered her hands. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had looked at him from behind a 4-inch gap in a chain door 10 days ago. The look of a woman deciding whether the thing in front of her was real or the kind of thing that looks real and then disappears. There's a red door, Ranger said. Sarah blinked. The front door, he said. It's red, bright red. Emma told me, in the waiting room. She said the house she wanted would have a red door. She said red is the color of fire, and her daddy's name was Blaze, and he always said they'd find a house with a real color door. He looked at Sarah directly. So we painted the door. Sarah pressed her lips together so hard they went white. He used to say that, she whispered. Every time we drove past a house with a boring door, he'd say, Sarah, when we get our house, it's going to have a door with a real color. A color that means something. Her voice had gone very thin. He said it 100 times. And Emma remembered, Ranger said. She was 3 years old when he said it last. She remembered every word. Sarah looked at the ceiling, at the fluorescent light and the plain white tiles, and the particular nowhere of a hospital room that has no personal meaning whatsoever. And she breathed through whatever was moving in her chest. Okay, she said finally. Okay. Okay, you'll take the house? Okay, I'll take the house. She looked back at him. In Ranger, she stopped. Yeah. Thank you. She said it carefully, the way you say something when thank you is not big enough, but is the best available word. For all of it, for being what he said you'd be. What did he say we'd be? Sarah almost smiled. He said you were the kind of men who showed up. He said he'd never met men like that before, who just showed up, no questions, no conditions, no calculation about what it cost. He said that was the rarest thing in the world. A pause. He was right. Ranger said nothing for a moment. He looked at his hands, at the wolf tattoo on his left forearm that a 4-year-old girl had pointed at in a diner and changed the trajectory of everything. He was better at seeing people than anyone I ever knew, Ranger said. Better than he was at seeing himself. He always underestimated himself, thought he wasn't enough. I told him the night before his wedding that the men who aren't enough never ask the question. He remembered that for years, brought it up twice that I know of. He paused. I hope Emma gets that too, the ability to see people the way he saw them. She already does, Sarah said. She already does it exactly the way he did. She looks at you and you feel like the most important person in the room. A small smile. She looked at Roy Stafford after he grabbed her arm and told me he was just unhappy inside. Ranger's jaw tightened briefly. She's not wrong, he said. Small men usually are. The day of discharge came on a Thursday, 21 days after surgery. Sarah walked out of UT Health on her own feet, slowly, with a hand on the railing and another hand in Emma's, and Emma walking beside her with the focused attention of someone whose job was to be exactly here, exactly now, which it was, and had been, and which was finally being done by choice instead of necessity. The brothers were in the parking lot. Not all 92. 8 were working, 3 were out of state. 1 was in a situation that Scout described as complicated and declined to elaborate on. But the rest of them were there, standing beside their bikes in the cold November morning air, waiting, the way they had been waiting in one form or another for 21 days. When Sarah came through the doors, Emma still holding her hand, yellow sneakers on her feet, and the rabbit under her arm, the brothers didn't cheer. They didn't make noise. They just stood there. 90-some men in leather, standing in a hospital parking lot on a Thursday morning, and they stood straight, and they were present, and that was the whole of it. Sarah stopped on the sidewalk and looked at them. She had met some of them. She had been introduced to others by name, by story, by the particular identifying details Emma had given them over 3 weeks of daily visits. That's Uncle Doc, who has very steady hands. That's Uncle Steele, who watches everything but doesn't say much. That's Uncle Preacher, who prays a lot and smells like cedar. But standing here, looking at all of them at once, was different. This was the full shape of what Connor had trusted. This was what a dying man had believed in with the last reliable strength of his hands, burning letters into leather at a kitchen table while his wife watched and understood for the first time exactly who her husband had been and how completely he had loved them. Thank you, Sarah said, to all of them, to no one specific, to the whole of it. Nobody said you're welcome. Nobody needed to. Tank nodded once. That was enough. Ranger drove, Sarah in the passenger seat, Emma on her lap. Emma having refused all alternative seating arrangements with the calm finality of a child who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. They pulled onto a quiet street, working streetlights, children's bikes against front porches, a 60-year-old oak tree throwing bare November branches against a gray sky. A house, modest, 2 bedrooms, a front porch with a railing that did not wobble, and a front door that was red, blazing, specific, unmistakable red. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth. Emma was out of the truck before Sarah could register the movement, running up the front walk, bare seconds ahead of any instruction or restraint, and stopping at the door, both hands flat against the red paint. She stood there for a moment, with her palms against the door and her eyes closed. And then she turned around with a face that was the closest thing to pure joy that Ranger had seen in 27 years of riding and living and losing and finding. "It's red!" Emma shouted. Her voice carried down the whole quiet street. Neighbors looked up from their Saturday morning business and saw a small girl with her hands raised and a face like the sun coming out. "Uncle Ranger, it's red! You remembered!" "I remembered," Ranger said. Emma turned back to the door. She pressed her cheek against it, like it was something alive, like it was something that had been waiting for her. "Daddy would love this," she said, to the door, to the sky, to wherever he was. "He always said our house was going to have a real color door." Sarah was out of the truck now, standing on the front walk, looking at the door, and then at Ranger, and then at her daughter with her face pressed against the red paint. She was not crying. She had moved past the kind of grief that cried. She was in the territory on the other side of that, the place where the weight has shifted from loss to something else. Not forgetting, never forgetting, just carrying it differently. "He can see it," Emma said. She turned around, those pale blue eyes, direct, certain. "From heaven, he can see the door." "He absolutely can," Ranger said. "He knows we found the right house," Emma said. "He knows." Emma looked at the door one more time. Then she looked at Ranger with an expression that was part his old brother's eyes in a new face, part something entirely her own, the specific, particular Emma Reed quality that did not come from Connor or Sarah, but from the 9 months she had spent becoming exactly herself in the hardest possible conditions. "Daddy's the one who told me to find you," she said. "But you're the one who made the door red." She paused. "That was you. That was your idea." Ranger looked at this child. "Yeah," he said, "that was mine." Emma nodded, processing it, assigning it its proper weight. "That means you were already being family," she said, "before you even knew you were." Tank made a sound behind Ranger. He covered it with a cough. Nobody acknowledged the cough. Ranger crouched down until he was eye level with Emma Reed, there on the front walk of the house with the red door, in the November morning, with the oak tree above them and the sky gray and vast, and the whole quiet street going about its ordinary life, entirely unaware that something extraordinary had just parked itself permanently in its midst. "Yeah, kid," Ranger said. "I think maybe we were." Emma reached out and took his hand, her small fingers barely wrapped around two of his. She looked at the red door. He looked at the red door. They stood there together for a moment, a 65-year-old man and a 4-year-old girl, connected by a dead man's leather keychain, and 11 years of friendship, and 9 months of absence, and 14 blocks of Texas pavement walked on bare feet. "Can we go inside?" Emma asked. "It's your house," Ranger said. "You go first." Emma looked at him. Then she looked at the door. Then she looked back at him with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, the full one, the one that had been learning to stay. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the red paint one more time, and then she pushed it open. Years pass the way years pass when life stops being about surviving and starts being about living, quickly, quietly, and with the particular sweetness of things that are not taken for granted because the person experiencing them once came very close to not experiencing anything at all. Sarah healed. Not overnight, not without cost. The recovery was brutal in the specific way that genuine repairs are brutal. Weeks of pain that arrived in waves, medication that killed her appetite, physical therapy sessions that left her shaking and wrung out, and having to be talked back to the table by Emma, who sat across from her every single time and said, "Daddy didn't quit. You don't quit either." Said it at 7 years old like she had been saying it for decades. Said it the way she said everything that mattered, without drama, without performance, just the clean, level delivery of a truth she had decided was non-negotiable. Sarah did not quit. By Emma's 6th birthday, the color was back in her face permanently. By Emma's 7th, She had gone back to school for the paralegal certification she had put down when Connor got sick. By Emma's ninth, she was running the contract division of a downtown firm whose senior partner called Ranger one afternoon and said, unprompted, "I don't know who sent this woman to me, but I want to keep her for the rest of my professional life." Ranger said, "You're welcome," and hung up and never told Sarah. Because Sarah had enough people telling her she was remarkable, and what she needed was someone who expected it. The brothers came every Sunday, not because anyone required it, not because a schedule said so, because Sunday morning was what it had always been. Billy's Roadhouse, Route 35, the pushed-together tables in the corner, the canyon, and now it also included a booth near the window where a small girl with yellow curls sat and ate waffles with rainbow sprinkles, and argued with Scout about the correct use of color in coloring books. And that was simply part of what Sunday was. At 7, Tank taught Emma to change a tire. She got grease on everything, including a neighbor's fence she had no business being near, and she loved every second of it and asked to do it again immediately. Tank said yes. Ranger said yes. Sarah said yes with a look on her face that meant she would be doing laundry for the rest of the week, and had already made her peace with it. At 9, Ratch sat with Emma at the kitchen table in the house with the red door every Tuesday evening and worked through math problems. She was 2 grade levels ahead by the end of the first year. By the end of the second, she was asking questions that took Ratch longer than a minute to answer, which had not happened to Ratch since graduate school. He told Ranger mid-year 3, with an expression that was equal parts pride and genuine bewilderment, "She's smarter than me right now. Not smarter than me at 9, smarter than me right now, today, at my current age." Ranger said, "I know." Ratch said, "It's not discouraging, it's spectacular." Then he went back to her and continued. At 11, Preacher gave her a journal. Brown leather, thick pages, good binding. He set it on the table in front of her and said, "Write everything down. Your dad never kept anything written. All we have now are memories and one photograph. Write it all, every moment, every feeling, everything you want to remember." Emma looked at the journal for a long moment. Then she opened it to the first page and wrote the date in one sentence. Preacher asked her later what the first sentence was. Emma told him. He didn't repeat it to anyone. He carried it with him like a private prayer. She filled 17 journals by the time she was 18. Every page, front and back. At 14, Steele took her to the hill country and showed her the place where the bonfire in the photograph had been. He pointed out where each man had been standing, where Ranger was, where Connor was, where they were together at the exact moment the photograph was taken. Steele talked for 2 hours. It was the most words he had said consecutively in his adult life. And Emma sat in the center of the stone ring the entire time with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes on his face, absorbing every word the way she absorbed everything that had to do with her father, completely, without interruption, without rushing him toward the end. When he finished, she said, "Tell me the parts you left out." Steele looked at her. "You edited," she said. "I could tell. Tell me the parts you thought I might not be ready for." Steele was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her those parts too. And Emma sat in the ring of old stones and listened to the unedited version of who her father had been. Not the legend, not the carefully preserved memory, but the real man, complicated and loyal, and sometimes wrong, and always, always trying. And she nodded, and she did not flinch once. "That's who I thought he was," she said when Steele finished. "Yeah," Steele said, "that's who he was." At 15, Judge taught her to ride. She fell twice, got back on 3 times, and by the end of the afternoon she was circling the parking lot at the clubhouse with a grin on her face that stopped every man present in whatever they were doing, because it was Connor Reed's grin. Exact, unmistakable, the grin of someone who has found the specific thing they were built for and is completely certain of it. "She's a natural," Judge told Ranger. "She's her father's daughter," Ranger said. "No," Judge said. She's better, because she knows what it cost. Then came the Thursday in November when Ranger was 71 years old, and he sat Emma down at the kitchen table in his house and told her what the doctor had said. He did not soften it. He had never softened anything for Emma, and he was not going to start now, because Emma had always met the truth head on, and it would have been a disrespect to offer her anything less. Emma listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, I'm coming every day." "Emma, every day," she said, "non-negotiable." She paused. "And I'm reading to you. Pirate stories. The same ones you used to read me." She looked at him directly. "You did all the voices, so I'm going to do all the voices. Fair is fair." Ranger looked at this young woman across his kitchen table. 20 years old, blonde, the pale blue eyes, the lifted chin that had never once gone down in all the years he'd known her. Connor Reed's grin somewhere in the architecture of her face, waiting for the moments that earned it. "The captain voice?" he said. "Low and slow and gravelly," she said. "The parrot? Ridiculous and high-pitched, just like yours." He laughed, and it felt like the best thing he had done in months. She came every day. She read to him while he sat in the chair by the window, and the Texas winter built itself outside the glass. She did all the voices without self-consciousness, fully committed, the captain voice genuinely gravelly, and the parrot voice so absurd that on the good days he laughed so hard he coughed, and on the harder days she just kept reading through the coughing without pausing, because she had learned a long time ago that you keep going, you keep reading, you keep holding on, even when the person beside you is struggling, especially then. The brothers rotated through, not on a schedule, just present, the way they had always been present. Tank on Tuesdays, Scout whenever he could manage it, Doc every Friday to check vitals and pretend it was a social call, and fool absolutely nobody. Preacher came and prayed in the corner the way he always prayed, quietly, with the cross in both hands, and Ranger never asked him to stop and never would. One afternoon in February, just the two of them in the room, Ranger's voice thin, but his mind still entirely clear, he said, "I dreamed about your dad last night." Emma put the book down. "What did he look like?" "Young, the way he looked in the photograph by the bonfire. Strong, laughing." "What did he say?" Ranger was quiet for a moment. "Two words," he said. "Thank you." Emma did not look away. She held his eyes. "For what?" she asked. "For keeping the promise." Emma reached out and took his hand, the hand that had lifted her in a hospital waiting room when she was 4 years old and finally free, the hand that had been the wall she fell against when everything gave way. She took it now and held it and felt how it had changed, thinner, lighter, and how it was still warm. "You didn't just keep a promise," she said. "You gave us a life." Ranger smiled. The smile of a man who has ridden 1,000,000 miles and made 1,000 decisions, and lost people, and found people, and bent the world when it needed bending, and who has arrived, at the end of all of it, at a specific and certain knowledge of what mattered and what did not. "That's all I ever wanted," he said. He passed that night, quiet, warm, with the people who loved him close enough to touch. The funeral drew 400 bikers from every chapter in the Southeast. Engines revved 3 times in unison, and the thunder of it rolled across the Texas hills and traveled for miles in every direction. Emma spoke. She stood in front of 400 men in leather, and she told them about a Sunday morning when she was 4 years old, and walked into a diner in her dead father's flannel shirt and changed the world. She told them about waffles with rainbow sprinkles, about brown crayons and yellow sneakers and a red front door, about pirate stories in the captain voice and 13 minutes of crying in a hospital waiting room. That was the moment she stopped being a child who had to be strong and became a child who was simply allowed to be. She told them about a man who carried her through the worst hours of her life and never once asked her to stop feeling them. She looked at the front row, the original brothers, grayer, some with canes, Tank's hair completely white, Scout moving slower, Doc's hands still the steadiest things in any room. Preacher's cross replaced twice over the years, but always the same weight in his hand. Steele at the end of the row, watching everything the way he always watched everything. All of them present, every single one. I found strangers that day, Emma said. They became my family. They saved my mother's life. They raised me, and they taught me that loyalty is not a word. It is a choice you make every day when it is inconvenient and expensive and exhausting and no one is watching. She held up her wrist. The leather bracelet with blaze burned into the hide. She had not taken it off in 16 years. My father died at 36, she said. He never saw me start school, never walked me to anything, never taught me to drive or danced with me or told me about boys. But he did something most parents never have to do. He planned for a world without him. He wrote a message. He burned it into leather with hands that could barely hold the tool. He trusted 92 men with everything he had left to trust anyone with. And those 92 men moved heaven and earth for a 4-year-old girl they had never met, because her father was their brother, and that was all the reason they needed. Her voice cracked. She let it. Brotherhood is not blood. It is showing up. It is keeping promises. It is riding through the dark to save a woman you have never met because her husband rode with you, and that means his family is your family. No exceptions. No expiration date. That evening, Emma stood alone before the memorial wall at the clubhouse. 2 photographs side by side. Connor, young and laughing, by the firelight, arm around Ranger's shoulders. Ranger, silver-haired, the wolf tattoo visible on his forearm, looking at the camera with the specific steadiness of a man who knows exactly who he is and has made his peace with every mile it cost him to find out. Emma reached out and touched her father's face, then Ranger's. "We're okay, Dad," she said quietly. "We're okay because you planned for us, because you burned a message into leather with hands that shook and trusted 92 people with everything you had left." She pressed the leather bracelet to her lips. "And Ranger, thank you for the red door, for the pirate stories, for holding me when I finally broke, for 92 uncles who showed up every Sunday and every birthday and every crisis and never once acted like any of it was more than they wanted to do." She stepped back from the wall. Outside, the Texas evening was warm and dark and full of the sound of crickets, and somewhere down the road an engine, a single Harley, growing fainter. She listened until it was gone. Then she listened one moment longer. Because somewhere on the road between here and wherever the road goes after the last mile, 2 men were riding side by side, young again, laughing, shoulder to shoulder, the way they'd been in the photograph the night the bonfire burned in the hill country and everything was still ahead. The engines go quiet, the men rest. But the family they built in fire and faith and 14 blocks of Texas pavement, in a leather keychain and a dying man's trust, and a little girl who refused to look away, that family does not rest, does not fade, does not end. It rides on. In 17 journals filled front and back, in a red front door on a quiet street, in a woman who healed and a young woman who never forgot, and 92 men who showed up when it mattered, and kept showing up long after anyone was keeping score. Connor Reed burned his message into leather because he believed it would last longer than ink. He was right. It lasted forever.